So good day, hello everybody. I'm Stephen Jenkins from the Social Policy Department, also associated with the III, convener of something called GEO, Global Inequalities Observatory. Didn't know about that, did you? There's lots of stuff going on. Very pleased to be chairing today's seminar. You can see the title, Poverty in India after 2011. 2011, as you'll see, is a very important date in India's statistical history, for the reasons Peter will explain. Indeed, this is very pleased to welcome Peter. He's a professor in development economics at Amsterdam. Long time working in the research department of World Bank. And I think of him as a magician. Why should I say that? Well, some of the things that Peter's most well known on are to do with making up the data. He has a magic wand which works in areas where data are incomplete. So one of the first things he was particularly known for was poverty mapping, otherwise known as small area statistics, where you don't know it, you've got some stuff at the bigger area, but you don't want to get information about a smaller area, about poverty. So how do you do it? Relatedly, other things I came across are to do with synthetic panels. You've got repeated cross sections, but you want to look at dynamics. You can't, so you bring out the magic wand again. So we've got small area statistics, we've got synthetic panels, and now another thing beginning with S, we've got surveys to surveys, which is some of the things that Pedro is working on, and so on. So it's, I'm really interested to hear the magic wand man in action today. So we're going to, as usual, Peter will speak for about 3/4 of an hour, and then we'll have open for questions. No interrupting, please, unless for absolute clarification. That's partly because the online audience. Peter, over to you.
Great, thanks very much, Stephen. Thanks very much for this opportunity to give this talk here today. It's been a long time since I was at LSE myself, about 35 years, and hardly recognize this place anymore, but it's great to be back. So yeah, this paper is a paper that's joint with Professor Lanjouw at the JNU in Delhi, as well as a PhD student of mine in Amsterdam called Philip Shermer. And as Stephen mentioned, it's called Poverty in India after 2011. And what we're trying to do is to assess what's been happening. And basically, the question is, what has been happening in recent years in India? Stephen mentioned this question of a sort of magic wand being necessary, and that's really true. And it's something that's actually, I think, an issue that's increasingly pertinent, not just in India, but actually around the world. This morning's FT, there's an article talking about how GDP data in China are being questioned. People are not really sure what's going on there. Indian data. Similarly, we know about the BLS situation in the US, where some of the data are being refuted by the administration. And so there's a lot of questions about how are we going to be, what's happening empirically when we don't have the necessary data. So I'm going to be focusing on poverty, and I'm going to be thinking about poverty very much, in a very sort of standard conventional sense as a shortfall of income or consumption, where you fall sort of below a poverty line. I'm not thinking too much about these broader concepts like multidimensional poverty or anything here. And in India, what we have is official estimates of poverty, sort of used on a conventional basis, for most recently 2011 and 12. That's the last year for which there was an official government-endorsed, government-accepted estimate of poverty in India. And what we're obviously interested in knowing is what happened since. We've had lots of very significant events that occurred in India. We had demonetization in the early 2010s, and then we had obviously COVID. We've had elections, and we've had a variety of anti-poverty programs that have been launched or expanded or reduced. So it'd be really valuable and useful and important to know what's been going on since 2011. And in particular, something that seems very important in a country the size of India is to also know what's been happening at sort of subnational level. I mean, as you'll see, there are quite a few numbers that have been put forward, most of those have been sort of at the national level, at the all India level, possibly separate for rural and urban areas. Relatively few of the contributions that have come out in recent years have actually tried to produce estimates also at the subnational level, at the state level. That's what we're doing here. So I won't be going into the direction Stephen mentioned of small area estimates. I'll be limiting my disaggregation to going from the national to the state level. In a country like India, the state level still pretty aggregate. So the background, why is this particularly irrelevant? I think at the moment, so in recent months, we've had quite a lot of upheaval in the debates in India. In June of this year, the World Bank actually came out with an estimate of what's the current poverty rates in India. And they estimated a reduction in poverty between 2011 and 2022, which is the most recent survey data that they were able to use, where poverty falls from 27% of the population, so over a quarter of the population, about 1/20th of the population. So it's a dramatic reduction in poverty. Now, these estimates were put forward by the World Bank. They've actually been incorporated into the World Bank's poverty and inequality platform. They basically represent the World Bank's official estimates of where poverty is in India. And the government of India, while it hasn't formally endorsed these numbers, hasn't proclaimed these to be the official numbers, they haven't taken full ownership of these numbers. Politically, it's been very convenient for them to trumpet these numbers very widely. And so there's been a lot of attention in the newspapers to these numbers, and the government has been very, very active in disseminating these estimates. Okay. And so the question is this convincing? I guess you can probably guess that already the way I've presented this, there's at least some doubts in my mind. Now, I have to give I guess some institutional background on how poverty is measured in India. Typically, the data that underpin official poverty estimates in India are known as the Consumption and Expenditure Survey, CES. And the most recent version, the 2022 version, is called the Household Consumption Expenditure Survey. Essentially, these are the same surveys. Very large samples, typically above 100,000 households are surveyed, and they get collected every 5 years. And we have kind of a time series of poverty estimates drawing on these types of surveys that go all the way back to the early 1980s and even before. It's actually one of the big, I think, one of the really impressive contributions of India to global poverty analysis is that the eminent statistician Mahalanobis really pioneered these household surveys in the 1940s and the 1950s. So India has a very long tradition of doing really good quality, very carefully constructed survey data collection. And these consumption surveys basically represent these. Now, as I mentioned, the last round of data that we have that have actually supported an official estimate of poverty were from 2011. In 2017, a new round of the CES survey had been collected, assembled, and then the government suddenly, without any advance warning, basically withdrew these data from public access. So no real reasons were given and no concrete reasons were given, but doubts were expressed as to the quality of the data that had been collected. So in 2017, these data should have become available, but were not. They were not made available. Then this caused obviously a lot of controversy and so on. This 2022-23, the government came out with a new round of data, and these data were released, and they were released in June of 2024. Okay. Now, it would be nice to just look at those two data sets, the 2011 and the 2022, and then just see what happened to poverty. But that's complicated because there's serious issues of comparability that arose between those two sets of survey data. And unfortunately, there hadn't been any careful kind of bridging or pilot thing done to sort of assess what the impact of the changes were that had been introduced. The kind of changes that had been introduced is that they changed the definition of consumption. Called in India, it's known as the most recent survey, the HCES, uses a concept of consumption called the MMRP concept, which is the mixed modified reference period concept, where different types of consumption items are collected were different reference periods. Food is collected over a reference period of about 7 days, some basic non-foods over 30 days, durables over a year, and so that's called the mixed modified reference period. The 2011 survey analysis had been conducted on the basis of what's known as the MRP, which is just a modified reference period, where everything was a 30-day reference period. And well, the exception of food was 7 days, everything else was 30 days. Now, the 2011 had that they were going to shift toward this MMRP concept, that they had also fielded around with the MMRP definition of consumption. But there are a number of additional changes that were introduced in the HCES of 2022, which make it even that MMRP consumption number between 2011 and 2022 non-comparable. They introduced a system whereby they didn't go to a household and survey the households just once. They visited each household 3 times, with different portions of the questionnaire being asked at those different occasions of those visits. They used the CAPI, the computer-assisted personal, I can't remember, interview system, whereby they entered everything into computers with sort of predefined structures and so on, as opposed to 2011 when everything had just been entered onto a paper questionnaire. They also changed the level of disaggregation of certain consumption items in the consumption. All of these things have resulted in a concern that there is a real issue of comparability, even of the MMRP consumption definition in these 2 rounds of survey data. So this exercise was just straightforwardly calculating poverty rates from 2022 to 2020, from 2011 to 2022 is not really a viable proposition. Now, the World Bank, in its exercise, introduced a number of adjustments to the consumption definition, the MMRP consumption definition that they collected, because what they're trying to do is persuade India to move towards a concept of consumption as a welfare indicator, rather than just capturing consumption expenditures, which is the way the CESs have been historically collected. So they introduced a number of modifications to the way the consumption aggregate is constructed. And they also use their global poverty line, which is at $3 a day using 2021 purchasing power parity price indices. So that's not necessarily what the Indians used when they supported their official poverty estimates in 2011. In fact, in India, they used a poverty line that was proposed by a committee of experts called the Tendulkar Committee. They had done a whole bunch of work during the early 2000s to propose a particular methodology for coming up with the poverty line and for measuring comparability. So the World Bank calculation doesn't really mirror that procedure at all. So they also use the World Bank also uses a consumer price index to sort of scale up the poverty line from 2011 to 2022 in order to capture the impact of inflation, which is something that the Tendulkar Committee had not recommended. They had recommended an alternative cost of living adjustment, essentially a Fisher price index. So there's a number of reasons as to why the World Bank estimates, even for 2011, were not necessarily the same as the poverty estimates that the government of India produced for the world. Turns out, coincidentally, that the numbers are not that massively different. So the official poverty estimate that the Indian government had endorsed for 2011 was a 22% poverty rate for the country as a whole, and the World Bank's poverty rate for 2011 was 27%. So they're reasonably close. So the real question is there's this massive decline. That's really what we're most interested in. So the procedure that I'll be outlining in this paper is we're trying to get around all these sources of possible non-comparability and concerns. So we're going to introduce an approach that is consistent with the Tendulkar Committee. So we're going to use exactly the same poverty line that the Tendulkar Committee had recommended for 2011. We're not going to deviate from that. We're also going to recognize that there are changes in the way that the consumption definition has been constructed. So we're going to introduce a method that's robust to that. We're not going to revisit the poverty line. We're just going to use the poverty line from 2011. And we're not going to get into the debate about which is the appropriate cost of living adjustment that's necessary. But and this is why it's not actually magic, the way Stephen has suggested, we have to make assumptions to be able to proceed. And so everything, of course, in the end hinges on whether the underlying assumptions seem reasonable or not. Okay. This is an approach that, as Stephen mentioned, I've been involved in this type of work for some time. In India itself, this type of work had already been explored in the context of what's known as the Great India Poverty Debate in the early 2000s, when there was a kind of a similar degree of controversy between the 1999 round of the CES and the 2004 round of the CES. So, and my co-author Himanshu and his co-author Abhijit Sen has really addressed that concern there, and we're kind of building on those types of ideas in this paper. So what we're going to be doing is this procedure that Stephen mentioned called survey imputation procedure, and we're going to draw on official survey data. We're going to stick with the National Sample Survey Organization's data that are being collected by this venerable statistical agency. And I'm emphasizing this because, as you can see, there have been alternative approaches, particularly by the World Bank has been exploring alternative approaches using other data, including a private sector data source called the Consumer Pyramid Household Survey. And there was an influential paper published in the Journal of Development Economics in 2023, I think, where they used those data to try to get a sense of what happened between 2011 and 2019 at the time. But that consumer pyramids household survey data is somewhat controversial as well. It's a very different animal than the National Sample Survey data. So we are trying to stick with the data that are collected by the National Sample Survey Organization. And we're going to be looking at the consumption survey, the CES and the HCES surveys that I've already mentioned, but we're also going to be looking at labor force survey data. So we're going to look at both employment survey data as well as consumption data. The employment survey data that we're using there's a round in 2011, so there's 1 year in 2011 when we have both consumption survey data as well as a employment and unemployment survey from 2011. And then in 2017, there was a whole series of employment surveys that were collected, modeled very closely on the 2011 unemployment survey, called now as the periodic labor force surveys. Those surveys are actually very, very close in terms. They're basically following the same structure. So and they're nice because they're an annual survey data from 2017 all the way through to 2021-22. So, and then as I already mentioned, what we're also going to be interested in is implementing this procedure to also produce state level estimates. And this is important because I think historically in India, it's always been the case that poverty is measured sort of at the state level, and the national poverty number is basically the aggregation of those state level poverty estimates. You take a population weighted average of the head count rates for each state, and you get the national poverty rate. The procedures that have been implemented so far have tended to try to go directly to the national poverty rate without looking carefully at what that implied with respect to state level patterns. And we're going to try to stay more within that spirit of aggregating up from state level estimates. So the basic idea that we're implementing is really a basic idea is to sort of take a household survey from, say, 2011 is our sort of our favorite household survey data, and we're going to estimate a model of consumption in that survey, and then we're going to predict using parameter estimates from that model to predict consumption into the other rounds of data. Okay, the HCES from 2022 or alternatively PLFSS. Okay, so you basically the procedures you estimate poverty, you predict income from a training data set, which would be our 2011 data set, and you estimate poverty in an output data set, which is any of these other labor force surveys. So key assumption in that procedure is that the model that you're implementing, parameter estimates that you get from that model, those parameter estimates don't change dramatically over time. The covariates, the planetary variables in the model may change over time, but the parameter estimates are assumed to stay fairly stable. So it's a stability assumption that we are implementing. And just to sort of summarize it, we have our training data are going to be the consumption survey from 2011, and also in a second attempt, in the second round, we're also going to use the employment and unemployment survey from 2011 to sort of calibrate our model, to specify a model of consumption. We're going to take the parameter estimates into first the CES from the HCES from 2022, and then subsequently into the PLFS surveys from 2017 to 2022, where we have explanatory variables. that are identical in the two surveys. So we're looking at things like occupation, education, household size, characteristics of the households that are basically identically defined in the different rounds of survey data. We have parameter estimates that relate those household characteristics to consumption in 2011. So we can take those parameter estimates and then predict consumption in those output data sets. The key point to recognize is that we have these explanatory variables, and these are things like occupation, education, and so on, and that they're defined in an identical way in the different rounds. They can change in terms of values. We would expect education levels or occupation patterns and so on to change over time. But we're going to assume that the parameter estimates that relate these characteristics to consumption in the 2011 data sets are basically going to stay stable, be unchanging over time. And that's the key assumption that we're going to be making. What we do sort of in terms of actually procedurally, we estimate this model, then we draw from the distribution of these parameter estimates, both the parameter estimates as well as the residuals. We take draws from the observed distribution in the 2011 survey data. We plug all of them into the output data sets to predict consumption defined in 2011 terms. This is why we can dispense with any price indices. We predict consumption defined in terms of 2011 consumption on the basis of the fact that we have explanatory variables from the 2022 data, but parameter estimates from the 2011 data set, and we take repeated draws from the betas and the residuals to produce repeated estimates of consumption in the 2022 data sets, and then we calculate poverty rates repeatedly and take the average across those to get our expected poverty rates in 2022. That's essentially the mechanics of how the procedure works. And this is basically building on the approach that Stephen mentioned when we first started exploring these imputation approaches with small area estimation. Small area estimation, we basically sort of explored that approach and are applying essentially the same approach here.
Yeah. Sorry. The stability assumptions includes no changes in relative prices, relative wages between sectors.
Well, we'll talk a little bit about that at one point we have no price variables expressed in terms of financial money terms on the right hand side. So they're just like years of education and so on. So in that case, we don't have to worry about the relative price changes in prices so much. But then we will also explore the inclusion of sort of wage data and so on. And at that point, we do have to take into account price changes as well over time.
But if a poor worker works in a sector and then something happens to the sector and the sector goes up or down, for you that's included in the stability assumption.
That's part of the stability. And I'm going to come back to that because the stability assumption is really critical here, and whether that is sensible or not, and which of the approaches makes sense given the need to impose that stability assumption is really critical. It's really important here. So that we'll come back to that. Okay, so one question is, again, what's the history of this, and can we expect this procedure to work well? So in the paper that we've written, we actually go back to 2004 and 2011, the gap between 2004 and 2011. This is a period when there was no controversy about the consumption data at all. The surveys were identical. There was no real concern about comparability at all. It was also a period with very rapid poverty reductions. Poverty reduction between 2004 and 2011 was quite rapid. Economic growth had really accelerated in India at that time in the early 2000s, and poverty reduction was also observed to have fallen. This isn't controversial. This isn't questioned. This is what people broadly accepted because the data are strictly comparable. So we ask ourselves, can we replicate the official estimates of poverty by implementing this procedure, by estimating a model in the 2004 data, predicting it into the 2011 data, and then comparing our predicted poverty rates to the actual observable poverty rates. And we actually have quite some success in that. It's actually able to do a really good job of tracking poverty change over that interval. That doesn't guarantee, of course, that it works well going forward from 2011, but gives us some comfort that the method in principle can work but we will come back to that as well. So between 2004 and 2011, poverty had fallen from 37 to 22%, so a very dramatic reduction in poverty. And we're able to replicate that reduction in poverty by applying the survey imputation procedure. Okay, now, yeah.
Very good question. Does this procedure works at the micro level? I mean, can you identify poor households or just the rates?
Mechanically, you can, but if you start taking into account the precision of these things are these parameter estimates are estimated with imprecision. You have the bottom line is that if you calculate confidence intervals around your poverty estimates, if you were to do that, if you're trying to produce a household level estimate, you'd have an enormous confidence interval. So you'd be able to produce an estimate of consumption, but you'd also have an incredibly wide range of plausible consumption. So it'd be operationally not very practical. And we found in our small area estimation literature that you really do need to aggregate across a sufficiently large sample of households before the confidence interval is reasonable. And so it's a real warning against going you can't disaggregate too far. And that's true with household survey data anyway, that you can't really disaggregate too far with the kind of estimates of poverty that we use. So far I haven't really spoken much about the labor force surveys, so just a quick word about labor force surveys. So as I mentioned, in 2011, there was this employment and unemployment survey, the EUS, same organization that collects the CES data, using very similar procedure, the same trained investigators, and so on. And it does include a consumption aggregate, the EUS. It doesn't have the full consumption aggregate that we find in the CES surveys, but it has a consumption aggregate which is more abbreviated, slightly shorter questionnaire. And so historically, it's never been used to underpin official poverty estimates, but it is available in the EUS survey. Okay. Then in 2017, the NSS introduced and started fielding these PLFS surveys, which were also labor force surveys, modeled very, very closely on the EUS survey. One innovation or one adjustment that they did introduce is that they kind of eliminated that consumption aggregate that was available in the EUS. They didn't replicate that in the PLFS surveys. They had an even more abbreviated, a very, very simple 1 or 2 question based consumption number in the PLFS surveys. But really, you can't compare the EUS and the PLFS consumption data either. But we do have a consumption number in the EUS survey that is reasonably comprehensive, not as comprehensive as in the CES, but reasonably comprehensive. Here's a table just showing you that what all of the surveys that we're dealing with, CES is from 2022, and the EUS from 2000, the EU CES from 2011, the EUS from 2011, and then all the PLFSs. They're basically describing the same population. We're just giving you a number of characteristics of the demographic structure of the population, just to convince you that we're not talking about these surveys, any of the surveys sort of drawing a sample from an entirely different population. It's obviously something we need to have data sets that are describing the same underlying population to be able to implement this procedure. Okay, so basically the paper is going to be described, basically what we do in this paper is implement 2 approaches. First approach is we apply the survey methodology to impute from the 2011 consumption survey, CES, into the 2022 consumption survey, the HCES. So that's one, we just basically see what do we get when we do that, what are the kind of poverty numbers that come out of that exercise. Then we implement a second approach, kind of a sort of robustness, and I'll come back to why we actually think the second approach is more appealing, where we actually say we're going to use these employment surveys. So the first question we have to ask, the sub-question is, can we look at the EUS and the CES from 2011? Can we be completely comfortable that these 2 surveys are capturing exactly the same population? So we do a check. We basically impute consumption from the 2011 into the EUS, and then we estimate predicted the EUS poverty rates that we get in the EUS from this imputed consumption number, and then we compare that to the actually observed EUS CES consumption numbers for that same year. And we find that that works very, very well. And we produce basically state level as well as national level estimates that are essentially identical. So it kind of tells us that if we implement the survey procedure from the CES into the EUS, we can reproduce the CES poverty numbers in the EUS survey, okay? What we then do is we say, okay, given that we're comfortable that these surveys are identical and that this procedure works in that exercise of computing from the CES to the EUS, what we're now going to do, we're going to look at the consumption data in the EUS, and we're going to redefine our poverty lines, the poverty lines that the Ten-Biltmer Committee had proposed for the CES data. We're going to redefine those poverty lines so that we can produce exactly the same headcount rates with the abbreviated consumption number in the EUS that we observed with the CES data and the Ten-Biltmer poverty lines. So we're redefining the poverty lines. In the paper, you'll see that it's actually a relatively modest adjustment to the poverty lines that we have to make. But we basically calibrate the poverty lines in such a way that in the EUS, using the EUS consumption number, we can generate exactly the same poverty numbers that we would produce with the CES and the Ten-Biltmer poverty lines. So that gives us the EUS as our training data. And we then implement the same procedure that we do in approach 1, where we go from the EUS to the PLFS surveys. Now, why do we like that? One of the appealing features of the PLFS surveys, unlike the CES surveys, is that they include much more information about labor market characteristics, labor market conditions, wage rates, employment rates, different types of employment, different types of occupations, and so on. This is something that's not available in the CES survey, so we can't include those types of variables as amongst our predictors in the approach 1. And so we're quite keen to be able to use those types of predictors because those types of predictors are likely to be more sensitive to changing economic circumstances than the kind of demographic, household, human capital type of characteristics, ownership of certain durable stocks that are available in the CES survey. So just to give you a sense of what we're doing, we did this robustness check here. We found that the method works quite well in replicating the true poverty lines, true poverty rates in the CES if we impute off of a model calibrated in the 2004 data. That was just to provide ourselves with some reassurance that the approach in principle could work. And then we have the two approaches. The first approach is we impute from the CES 2011 into the CES 2022, and we produce some estimates. The second approach is we do this little exercise of recalibrating the poverty lines, having done that imputation exercise between the CES 2011 and the EUS 2011. And we then impute from the EUS into the PLFSs, not just one PLFS, but all of them in turn. Okay, and that's our second approach. And then we do in the paper, we describe some robustness checks. We can obviously also go from the EUS to the PLF, to the EUS to the HCES and vice versa to sort of see whether things change a little bit. But our two preferred approaches are, as described here, approach 1 and approach 2. Okay, now what we do, we're not going to move to this MMRP because the official Ten-Biltmer poverty lines were based on the MRP concept of consumption. That's what the Ten-Biltmer Committee had endorsed. Those are the official estimates. So we're going to continue working with the CES definition of consumption, the MRP, and we impute from the CES into the HCS. A whole variety of different models. One model is to estimate a model of consumption in the CES 2011 at the all India level, separately for rural and separately for urban areas, but includes state fixed effects. And we choose our covariates in that model on the basis of our economic intuition. So we think education should come in there. We think occupation or ownership of certain durables or sort of household demographics should come into the model. So we just use our economic reasoning to specify that model. We then go and say, well, let's allow for the possibility that these betas, these parameter estimates, are actually different in the different states of the country. So let's redo the whole modeling exercise at the state level, again, separately for rural and urban areas. Because the samples are so big, we still have many thousands of households at the state level, at least for the very large states. And in some of the very small states, we do run into sample size issues, but in the larger states, we still have plenty of sample size. So we can estimate these models at the state level. And so, again, we can do that with just basic our intuition, our economic intuition telling us what to do. finally, we can say, well, there is this, there are these approaches these days that, it might help you specify a model using LSE. So we can, rather than using our economic intuition, we let the data kind of tell us what's the best specification. So we also estimate these models at the state level, but use LSE to specify what the model should be. We use the Tendulkar Committee poverty lines or the refined poverty lines that generate the same poverty rates in the US. I'm not going to mention the Rangarajan poverty line thing. That's a separate story. Basically, our results are robust to that alternative approach using MMRP as a consumption definition. So yeah, as I mentioned, we have these state level, sector level models at the all India level, or state level models using either economic reasoning or LSE to specify what should be included in the model. Clearly, you have many possibilities of many variables that you could throw into these models, and you do want to try to be a bit sensible. You don't want to just go overboard. If these parameter estimates are estimated with precision, then that could translate over into the simulated consumption numbers in the output data set, which then leads to noisier estimates ultimately of poverty. So you do want to try to pay attention to what you include in the models. You don't want to deal with too much overfitting problems and so on. So you want to be a little bit careful about what you include in the models. This is, you probably can't see this, it's not really that important, but this is an example of the rural all India model that we, one of the versions of the all India model using our economic reasoning as a basis for estimating a model. We have 58,000 observations in this model because it's all at the all India level. We get an R-square that's above 0.5, so it's able to do quite well in explaining the variation in consumption. And you have the kind of variables that you would expect, and with the kind of parameter estimates and signs. I mean, everything's significant here, but the signs are in the direction that you would expect, kind of according to the intuition. These things are not to be understood as sort of causal models at all. They're just forecasting models, essentially. So we're not too worried about issues of endogeneity here at all. We're really just trying to predict consumption. But it's somewhat reassuring to see that overall the parameter estimates suggest that the variables would come in the kind of way that you would expect. And so this is an example of the model. And as I mentioned, we do this at the state level separately for rural and urban. So we have many versions of these models, and then also experiment with either LSE or just our intuition in terms of what we should throw into the models. And this is what we get. This is kind of the punchline. So this is approach one, going from CES to the HCS from 2022, from 2011 to 2022. In 2011, the official poverty numbers were 26% in rural areas, 14% in urban areas, and 22%. This is as per the Tendulkar Committee's officially endorsed estimates. And this is what we predict when we do these different models. So we see poverty rates that we predict that are ranging somewhere between 10 and I guess 12 or 14%, depending on what what model specification we use. So what we're getting on the basis of this approach here is a reduction in poverty as well, but nowhere near as dramatic as the reduction that the World Bank has been using or endorsing or adopting. So that's that first approach. One of the reasons that we're a little bit uncomfortable with this approach is because what we see, if we look at those are obviously the national level overall estimates, but if we actually look at the state level estimates that are produced by implementing this procedure, we get some very strange or somewhat startling results. For certain states, like this dark gray dot here is Uttar Pradesh. It's one of the biggest, most populous states in India, 200 million people that live in there. But the suggestion is that poverty declined dramatically in Uttar Pradesh. Poverty also declined significantly in Jharkhand, which is known to be a very poor state. Bihar has also seen quite a lot of poverty reduction. This does not really accord with intuition. So if you look at other things, other outcome indicators and so on, it's not really obvious that you should be expecting to see such large reductions in poverty in some of these poorer, very populous states. So that's something that we can't assert one way or the other these numbers are wrong. These are what come out of the exercise, but we do wonder a little bit about whether these numbers are entirely credible. Okay, so what are some of the reasons why we might be a little bit concerned, why we might think that this approach one is not giving us exactly what we should be looking at? One of them is that this assumption of stability might be particularly controversial in a context where you have a model that includes things like stocks of consumer durables that are owned, which are definitely included in these models going in this approach one. That type of data are available and they're good predictors of consumption. If you think about, over a time period from 2011 to 2022, looking over 10 years, you can think of something like a cell phone. Owning a cell phone in 2011 has probably had a very different association with overall welfare than a cell phone in 2022. And that enormous expansion and the spread of cell phone ownership over that time period. So it's precisely the kind of in the setting where maybe it's a little bit of a stretch to claim that the relationship between consumption and the ownership of a cell phone is unchanged over that kind of a time period. So with these durables, that might be a problem. On top of that, you also have these changes in the way the consumption of HCES data were collected. You had this multiple visit, you had copy, so the number of changes that may also result in a different recollection of households, different responses in terms of what they own in terms of durables. So again, those data may not be comparable. And then we have very few variables in these HCES and CES model with data sets that allow us to zero in on sort of labor market conditions. You would think that if the economy is growing, or if there's some kind of decline, or if there's COVID or demonetization, that would be reflected in things like wage rates in sort of employment of agricultural laborers and things like that. And we're not really able to include that in these types of models. So we put those numbers, we estimated those numbers, we produced those numbers, but we are still a little bit concerned about so what we do, very quick detour. It turns out that this survey, and this is why this survey exercise, I mean, it's potentially interesting and potentially useful, but also it's a delicate thing, and it's quite, you have to be quite careful. A separate paper that I've been working on, we've been looking at data for Peru, where we have data for 2012 all the way through to 2022. And in Peru, these are annual data. And we've done the survey exercise, and we actually have these consumption data are perfectly comparable. Nobody's really disputing there's no comparabilities or issues. There's no need for the survey procedure, but we're implementing the survey procedure to test it. Turns out we can do really well estimating poverty from 2012 to 2013, from 2012 to 2014, from 2012 to 2015, period when the economy of Peru was growing, but nothing really dramatic was happening. But when we tried to do the same thing from 2012 to 2019 and from there on, we get it completely wrong. So here, this black line here captures the true change of poverty between 2012 and 2019. This is what we get if we implement a model that is kind of the standard model, the kind of model that would also be underpinning our approach one, okay? A model that has demographics, occupation, some durable ownership, the kind of standard model that you would get. Basically, true poverty increased. These are all different types of poverty lines because we didn't want to specify, we didn't want to make it contingent on a particular poverty line. We just wanted the poverty lines to be allowed to vary. So this is the evolution of poverty at different poverty lines. Basically, an increase in poverty between 2012 and 2019. And that was due to the COVID pandemic, of course. And then if you just use the standard survey procedure, you actually predict a decline in poverty. So that's clearly wrong, and it's clearly not what we're looking for. If we then add just some income variables, so it turns out in Peru, we actually have data on incomes as well. So if we include income data as a predictor of consumption outcomes, well, then that really improves things well. And if we add government transfers as well to the model, then we do particularly well. So that's actually the blue triangles that we get here, the little blue pyramids, we're able to track true poverty very well once we have a survey model that includes labor markets, income types of variables, and it does very badly if we have variables that don't include income. And it does it really badly as well if we only include income variables. So we need both demographics and education and those types of characteristics, as well as the income characteristics, in order to be able to do reasonably well in this Peru application. So this is the reason that we then that's why we're wanted to implement the second approach. For the labor going from the EUS to the PLFS surveys, we're actually able to include these labor market variables. We're able to add time varying wage and employment regressors and so on. We use these EUS refined poverty lines to estimate the poverty in the EUS data, and then we just predict into the PLFS surveys. So what we do, this is basically what we now do. We go from the EUS in 2011, and then we basically impute into each of these subsequent years. We start off, as we did again, with 26% in rural areas, 14% in urban areas, 22% at the all India level, and this is what we get based on state level urban rural models with economic reasoning as our specification. We get a reduction in poverty again, but even less rapid than what we got when we went from in approach one. We went from the CES to the HCES. We get poverty declining from 22 to about 18%, and then not really changing much thereafter. There's a bit of an increase in the later years from 20, sort of probably reflecting the impact of COVID, but we don't basically see any major reduction in poverty beyond what occurred sort of between 2011 and 2017. These are basically just repeating the numbers for all the different model specifications. So the basic picture is the same. What we see when we look at the state level patterns is we see that things are a little bit more what we might have expected. The things line up. We don't see as rapid change as what we were getting in some of these states where you really wouldn't have expected it. So it lines up a little bit more with our intuition, but clearly we can't assert anything beyond just simply seeing that. And the slightly lower reduction in poverty is also mirrored by slightly lower reduction in poverty in all the states. I'm just summarizing here the poverty, the implication, if you take these numbers seriously and you actually count the number of poor people in India rather than just calculating the poverty rates, what you end up having is an increase in the numbers of poor people, or a much less rapid decline in the numbers of poor people than what we might have expected if you stuck with the World Bank kind of poverty estimates. Here's a kind of picture of what's going on sort of on the map. This is the map of poverty in India at the state level in 2011. The darker colored areas are the poorer areas. So this is why I was saying that Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Jharkhand, these are the kind of states that have had quite high poverty in 2011. And this is sort of what we get from our various approaches. If we go from 2011 directly to 2022 using the first approach one, we get an evolution of poverty at the state level that goes from this very dark area here to a much lighter area in the same region. And this is one of the things that we found a little bit startling from that approach one in terms of its results. If we go through the EUS for 2017 and then on to 2022 in the PLFSs, then we see the pattern of poverty. It's slower, the progress that we observe in that area that has historically been the poorest parts of the country. So, I won't talk about the extension, but we carried out a whole number of robustness checks and so on. And the basic conclusion is that we do not, in our paper, come out and claim that this is what the actual poverty rate is. All we're doing in our paper is suggesting that the poverty decline that's sort of that's implied by these numbers that are currently circulating seems really optimistic, and we aren't able to reproduce that, no matter how we push and pull the survey imputations. Our general impression is that poverty seems to have declined, but not anywhere as rapidly as what is often claimed. We've done some work where we try to look at alternative indicators, employment rates, wage trends, all kinds of things, different sectoral changes over time that Facundo was saying, of people shifting out of one sector into the other sector. We try to track what's been going on in terms of other data sources telling us what's been happening there. In India at this time, you've got a big increase, a big return of people to agriculture. So this is kind of going against this typical story of structural transformation, where over time, as a country grows, people shift out of agriculture into the non-agricultural sector. In fact, in India, it's been going the other way. We've got a big increase of return to agricultural employment between 2011 and subsequent years. We also have a reduction of female labor force participation in India of this time period. These are all indicators that suggest things are not all well in rural areas particularly, and again, it seemed to suggest that possibly the survey imputed estimates are possibly pointing in a more realistic picture of what's been going on. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much. So we've got about 10 minutes for questions, and if you're online, please post your comments in the chat, and Peter will tell me if there are any. Just wave your hand. Otherwise, fascinating stuff. Please.
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting. I have a question, actually, if I may, because you've probably studied this much more than anyone else I've been speaking to. The numbers that the World Bank produced, do you think they've done the best possible job at trying to harmonize?
I'm a World Bank, these are all friends of mine. This is what the World Bank has done, I think, is really careful work, and they've done really a thorough job. I was involved. I was kind of an advisor to the kind of work that they were doing. I think I mentioned, one thing is that they're trying to shift thinking about how to think about consumption away from a measure of just consumption spending, which is the way the Indians have historically calculated and constructed their consumption data. Elsewhere in the world, that the World Bank is supporting poverty work, it's been very much trying to persuade countries to adopt the kind of concept of consumption as a welfare indicator rather than just a measure of spending. The Indian idea was historically, if I'm correct, all the way back in the time of Mahalanobis, they wanted to measure consumption spending because that was the best way that they could get a handle on disposable income. So they were actually interested in disposable income, but they would measure consumption spending because it seemed like the best way of getting at that, given the kind of economy it is, highly informal and so on. Measuring income directly is really complicated. Everybody's farming, subsistence farming, and so on. So measuring income is very hard. But if you want to have an idea of how to capture disposable income, maybe looking at consumption spending is as a way of getting at it. So that was the idea originally. But now the World Bank is going around advocating, I'm a big proponent as well, that we should be thinking about consumption as a broader indicator of welfare, which means we also have to impute a value from housing, we have to impute the value of the stream of consumption service from the ownership of durables and so on. So that's what they've been really trying to push. Now, they've done the best they can with the consumption data that are available. They've had to make some choices that are controversial. They dropped a whole lot of spending on things like cars and things like bicycles, things like durable spending. They just dropped it. They added a whole bunch of value of subsidies and transfers that were received by the government. They created a consumption aggregate that looks quite different from what the Indians have historically worked with. And they've also used this global poverty line of $3 a day, which is not necessarily the poverty line that the Indians would use. And they've had to update it using cost of price indices that are controversial in the Indian context. So all of these things, and that's because they have to maintain comparability with all the global poverty work they're doing. So they have to make these choices, resulting in this very dramatic poverty reduction. And that's they need to estimate poverty for Indians in order to feed into their global poverty numbers, and that's where they come out. But it's I'm not convinced that the numbers are actually a really good portrayal of what's going on in the Indians. So we're having ongoing debates and my views about this. Please.
Okay.
Thank you. I had a question. So how does the evolution of this imputed consumption looks compared to the evolution of income, which you have in the labor force service? Because you use them as...
We don't have incomes because what we have is labor.
But you have government transfer as well, no?
Employment income, but we don't have self-employment income. So farmers, 60% or more of the population in India is engaged in farming. They're basically self-employed farmers, and we have no measure of income in the employment surveys for them. We have wage and labor force employment income, regular salary jobs, casual labor jobs, that kind of income we have, but we can't really compare that to the consumption.
But yet, I mean, you're using whatever you have
Right.
to predict, so you're only using
Yeah.
part of the income to
Exactly.
predict your
Yeah,
consumption,
we
right?
don't have agricultural income as a
Exactly.
percentage.
Because I mean, I was surprised about the little change that you see in COVID, and I
Yeah.
wanted to know whether in income you see, or in employment, you actually see something different.
Yeah,
First of all, and then second is, are you able to do your imputations in a way that will allow you to see what part of these changes in consumptions are due to precisely government interventions, so cash transfer, for example, changes in cash transfers, which would be also interesting to see, I mean, how,
Yeah,
whether
no,
this has had an effect or not.
Yeah, no, it would be nice to put cash, the transfers and things like that on the right-hand side, but we can't use, our consumption data don't tell us, what portion of consumption comes from transfers or so on. We don't have that, because all we have is just the consumption, what did they spend? The module about employment comes from a totally different part of the questionnaire. We don't really associate actual consumption to particular sources of income. But we do have the best we can in terms of incorporating what measures of income we have, earnings, in particular employment income on the right-hand side, when we try to predict consumption. That's the best that we can do.
So, Peter, can I just ask my, if I understand correctly, you don't use any of the consumption information from the latest survey?
Sorry.
That seems to be a
Well, we have what?
bit of Bayesian type theme, maybe, you might want to.
Yeah, no, you could remove
Way
things
of
like.
updating.
So there has been work done where you try to update, like you may not have the amounts consumed, but you might say there was consumption of eggs or something like that. You assume that that's unchanged over time, but we're worried a little bit about this. There's so many changes in the way that the data were collected that we're just.
I understand, but I just, from a stepping back conceptual point of view, given that you do survey to survey modeling, it's about whether or not you're throwing away, you're throwing away information. Is there not some information that you can use? Subject to the same thing with regard.
I think we can. I mean, we could have dummies for all kinds of different types of consumption items rather than trying to measure how much, but we had where eggs consumed, was milk consumed, and have that probably would help contribute to the prediction. But it is, you would have to, believe that they're comparable, those dummies. And as we draw a little bit of comfort from the fact that our imputation model without inclusion of consumption variables did quite a good job in 2004 to 2011. So it didn't seem like an enormous handicap there. But yeah.
Facundo, please.
Yes. No, these two questions may be silly, but when the World Bank is comparing 2011 with 2022, 2023, and you say there was a change in the concept of consumption, they did not redo the 2011.
They used the MMRP concept rather than the MRP, and they tried to make sure that the MMRP was, they tried to incorporate also the subsidies received. So they added like food that was provided in public distribution system in 2022. So then they went back to 2011, did the same there as well. So they tried to restore comparability, but they were never able to address the impact of the 3 visits to the households rather than a single visit, the impact of CAPI, the fact that certain consumption items were aggregated across the, so those things they weren't able to address.
And the second related question is, you are uncomfortable with the last result, but at the same time, the last result is anchored at the $3 per day line when the concept has changed.
Yeah.
Shouldn't we move the line and perhaps we could be closer to your result?
I completely agree. Now that's something that they're unable to do because they have to stick with this poverty line of $3 a day for their global poverty work more generally.
They can't do that.
But strictly speaking, the poverty line is a function of the definition of consumption. If the consumption definition changes, the poverty line should be different. And they basically aren't able to do that. So they don't.
But your intuition is that if we move the line closer to the new concept, the line will go up. and may go up substantially.
In 2011 or in 2022.
But in 2022.
Yeah, we think that the poverty line should go up in 2022, not only because of the definition of consumption, but also because the consumer price index that they're using, which is essentially a less Paris price index, really understates the amount of inflation that occurred.
No, but in real terms,
both of those
just due
things.
to the consumption.
Consumption index should go up as well, yeah.
Great. Many thanks, Peter. I think we've run out of time. Fascinating stuff, not just about the content, but the political economy of statistics. Amazing government in India can get away with not, a survey for over a decade and now embrace it. And we've got the World Bank here, we've got the government of India. You may not get an entry visa.
I think that the government, it's also the GDP data is controversial. I mean, it's just really worrying when for political reasons, you take the whole controversy about why 2017 were made released. There was one kind of leaked report, and they were analyzed without leaked reports because the poverty had increased, and in some areas their data, the data simply not made available. So it's really scary.
So we're not just measurement junkies, you guys. This is a big deal. Wonderful, Peter. Thanks very much. It was really interesting talk.